So, hello everyone, and welcome to the 2025 Israel Studies Winter Webinar Series. My name is Amichai Magen, and this webinar series is brought to you by the Israel Program at the Center on Democracy, Development and the Rule of Law here at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University. To keep you warm this winter, over the coming weeks, I'll be in conversation with some of Israel's sharpest scholars, analysts, and public intellectuals. And I invite you to be part of that conversation and to reach out to fellow students, faculty, and community members to join us. Our webinars will take place on Thursdays between 10 and 11:15 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, which is 8 to 9:15 p.m. in Israel. Each webinar will be recorded and made available on FSI's YouTube channel after the live event. And if you missed last year's webinars, you can find them there as well. Webinars are free and open to the public, and you can already register for some or all of them and check out our past and future events at cddrl.fsi.stanford.edu/Israel. The added advantage of registering is that we'll be able to notify you of our future events on campus or online. And we have a very rich and exciting Israel Studies program from now until the end of this academic year and beyond. Okay, now, I think it's fair to say that over the past 15 months, we have all been so consumed by the October 7th war, the hostages, questions of hard security, and the extraordinary geopolitical transformation of the Middle East over the past several months in particular, that we have paid less attention to many of the internal dynamics and debates in Israel itself. In this webinar series, we aim to begin to rectify that, and we want to do a deep dive into the ideas and the forces and dynamics that are shaping Israel as a state, as a society, as an economy, and a political culture. And that is primarily what we will explore in a set of conversations over the next few weeks, though we will undoubtedly comment on key developments in Israel and the region as they transpire. These are, after all, particularly tumultuous and consequential days for Israel and the region. Today, I am absolutely delighted to open this series of conversations with someone I have known and greatly admired for close to 3 decades, Dr. Einat Wilf. Einat is one of those rare people with whom you can productively talk for hours about topics as varied as culture and political thought, education, democracy, or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I don't always agree with her on everything, but I always learn something new and valuable from Einat. Einat also stands out for me as a person who is intellectually courageous, someone who is unafraid to challenge conventions, evolve as a thinker, and where appropriate, change her mind about important and difficult issues. So today, among other topics, I'm really looking forward to hear from Einat about her ideas journey and how her view of Israel and Israel's place in the world has changed since we first met in the late 1990s. Yes, she doesn't look that old. I do, but we've known it's been a while. Okay. Let me just say, I can't tell you how many requests I've received from students, from alumni, from community members over the past year, asking to hear Einat speak. We are doing this virtually this time, but I promise you that we will make every effort to bring her to campus for a proper visit in the foreseeable future. So a few words of formal biography. Einat was born and raised in Jerusalem. She studied at Harvard and INSEAD before completing a doctorate in political science at the University of Cambridge in England. She served as member of Knesset from 2010 to 2013, where she was chair of the Education Committee and member of the influential Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee. Prior to that, Einat worked very closely with the late Prime Minister, President Shimon, including as a foreign policy advisor, and she was a strategic consultant with McKinsey and Company. Dr. Wilf is also a prolific author and popular podcaster, and in recent years, she has used both formats to develop a set of ideas about that much maligned, much abused, and much misunderstood term, Zionism. Her excellent podcast is called We Should All Be Zionists, and her latest book is a collection of essays on Israel, Zionism, and the path to peace with the same title. And I encourage you both to read the book and subscribe to the podcast. They're just fantastic. So today we will speak about the Z word, Zionism, what it means, how it has evolved, how it has been hijacked and weaponized, and how it might be reclaimed. We will do this by hearing from Einat first for about 35 to 40 minutes, and then by having Einat address your questions. And you can submit your questions at any time using the Q&A tab on the Zoom platform. So please use the Q&A tab and not the chat tab. That's where I'll be checking your questions. I'll collect those questions and pose them to Einat for answers. Einat Wilf, welcome. Great to see you.
Thank you. It's good to see you, Amichai. Okay, thank you. That was most kind, and we'll jump right in. So I want to start with a scene when Assad's regime fell very rapidly in Syria. There were some little videos showing members of the military, which were supposed to be very loyal to the Assad family. They came from the minority Alawite sect. There were some videos showing them changing their clothes and basically blending among the population. And that became a kind of clear image that they were absolutely not interested in fighting for Assad. And regimes like that, they seem very strong, and then they crumble very, very quickly. And this led me to a thought that maybe when Sinwar was planning October 7th, maybe he imagined something like that. Maybe when he saw Israelis being very angry at Netanyahu, wanting him gone, willing to go to great length to see him gone, maybe he imagined that the Netanyahu government was like the equivalent of the Assad regime, and that just like the Syrian military did not at the critical moment fight to defend Assad, Israelis will not fight to defend Netanyahu. And I was wondering about that. Could it be that Sinwar, despite taking 15 courses when in Israeli jail in Open University about the history of the Jewish people and the history of Zionism, and he got great grades in those courses, could he really still so misunderstand us? Like, could it be that even he, who really made every effort to understand us and understood us well enough to launch a very successful attack, could it be that ultimately he did not understand the most fundamental issue of why we fight? Why We Fight was a series of films that was created by Frank Capra, the great director, during World War II. And they were so well done that Roosevelt decided they were made for the soldiers, but Roosevelt basically asked them to be shown to everyone because they were so well done. And Frank Capra really created this notion of freedom versus tyranny, that this is what the war was about. Now, the thing is this: Israelis don't need films. Israelis have a very clear and internal sense of what we're fighting for. And we're fighting for our one non-negotiable, which is Jewish sovereignty, aka Zionism. That's it. We're willing to compromise on a lot of things except for that. And for me, it was really interesting that ultimately that is, by the way, the thing that Arab leaders fall again and again. That's what they constantly misunderstand. They tell a story of white European settler colonialist crusaders, which are all basically synonyms for foreign. And as a result, their action plan is therefore to throw at the foreigners, like they did with the Crusader state, like they did with the French in Algeria. You saw Abu Mazen speak about Israel being like the Americans in Afghanistan, just a little longer, a little more fighting, a little more attacks, a little more violence, and these foreigners who clearly don't belong here will go. And again, even though they have successes in terms of sowing a lot of damage, ultimately they fail to understand that in our mind, we're fighting and we're sacrificing because we're home, not because we're some foreign white settler European colonialist crusaders. So that was just a kind of thought that I began with, that I think this remains very much at the core of both of who we are and what is the conflict. When Amichai, you alluded to kind of my own personal journey, is I always share with people that I grew up in Israel, in Jerusalem, in this political, social environment of secular labor Israel that became, especially in the 80s and 90s, very much associated with the idea that we can finally make peace. All we have to do is give the land that we possessed as a result of the 6-Day War, and that our enemies want nothing more. You know, they either want land, as in the case of Egypt, but especially the Palestinians, they only want the land in order to achieve their own self-determination, independence, and liberty. For our generation, I'm sure Amichai will remember well, the first Intifada, which now is kind of forgotten, was very seminal because it included this reversal of imagery. During the first Intifada, which had real elements of popular uprising, you had Palestinians, especially young ones, with slings. And suddenly the image was reversed. So just a moment, are they David and we're Goliath? And they had Molotov cocktails. And if you grow up in Israel, there's this famous image in the foundation of Israel of Dgania, you know, of the Israeli heroic soldier stopping the Syrian military onslaught with a Molotov cocktail. So just a moment, are we now this big Syrian army and the Palestinians are a people fighting for their independence? So the first Intifada created this like reversal of imagery. And as a result, we projected on the Palestinians the early Zionism. They are a people fighting for self-determination. They are a people seeking independence. And when you couple that with the general mood of the 1990s, the end of history, the fall of the Soviet Union, the end of apartheid, peace in Northern Ireland, all of this came together to create this notion of like, we can have peace. All that the Palestinians want is a state, a sovereign, independent state, just like we wanted in part of the land in the West Bank and Gaza. Just give them the land, get out of it, end the occupation, and we're going to have peace. And I voted for every Israeli prime minister who basically wanted to put this to the test. Especially, I mean, I voted for Rabin and Peres and Barak and Olmert, but there was a real sense of euphoria. And all these prime ministers, by the way, generally got big mandates. They did not trick their voters when they negotiated for peace. It wasn't like de Gaulle in Algeria. They actually carried out what their voters wanted. So as one of those voters, especially, I watch with anticipation and hope as Ehud Barak goes to Camp David, proposes peace with the Palestinians, with the PLO, with Arafat, a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, no settlements, no occupation, capital in East Jerusalem. And I watched Arafat walk away from that in 2000, Abu Mazen walk away from that in 2008. I supported disengagement from Gaza in the middle in 2005. This is when Paris is in government with Sharon, where we're like basically fine. If the Palestinians are not going to say yes to Palestinian state in negotiations, we're literally going to force them to take a Palestinian state. We're just going to get out of the territory and have them, just have them build their state even without an agreement. And I watch all that unfold. I live through the euphoria. I live through this butchery of the misnamed Second Intifada, although it was certainly not a popular uprising. And I begin to ask a very simple question. What do the Palestinians want? And during that time, I meet Palestinians. I do the research that becomes the book, The War of Return. And I realize that to their credit, they've always told us what they wanted. It's just that we either didn't listen, or when we listened, it sounded so preposterous, especially against this like end of history, like that we just assumed that it's a bargaining chip, it's a negotiating tactic. They're not serious. And lo and behold, they were serious. And as I do the research that becomes the book, The War of Return, I come across a quote that I've been using ever since. It's by Ernst Bevin, the British foreign minister after World War II. He was not a friend to the Jewish people, certainly not to those who wanted sovereignty, but he speaks and listens to the sides, and he needs to explain why Britain failed to carry out the mandate that it was charged with by the League of Nations, unanimously, by the way, to help the Jews achieve sovereignty, right? The Arabs are not failed. They get their states. They get Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and Transjordan, but the Jews don't get a state. So he needs to explain why. This is a failure of a promise to the international community. And he says, His Majesty's government is faced with an irreconcilable conflict. Now, this is February 47. Why do I love this quote? Because in February 47, you have no excuses. There are no settlements. There's no occupation. There's no Gaza Strip. There's no blockade. There's no BB. Basically, there's no Arab refugees. There's no state of Israel for that matter. So all the things that we are told today are the causes of Palestinian violence, they don't exist yet. So you have no excuses. That's what's so great about this moment. But without all these excuses, he already says that the conflict is irreconcilable. And he goes on to explain why. He says, look, in this land there are Jews and Arabs. No one, of course, is called a Palestinian. And he says each one of those groups has a top priority. So he says the Jews want to establish sovereign Jewish state. Great. The Jews want to exercise the universal principle of self-determination for their people in their homeland. That's Zionism. That's the one thing, right? That's the thing we fight for. That's the one thing we care about, establishing a sovereign state where we are at the mercy of no one, where we are no one's guests, where we are not tolerated, where we are, as the French say so beautifully, chez nous. We are home. We are in ourselves. That's what we're fighting for. That's what we want. Bevin correctly understands that. And then he says, and for the Arabs, the top priority, and remember, those are the Arabs of the land. So those are the ones that will later hijack the name Palestine to be called Palestinians. So he says, for them, the top priority is to resist to the last the establishment of Jewish sovereignty in any part of the land. Now, it's a fascinating formulation of the conflict. He's not saying the Jews want a state, the Arabs want a state, and we need some help drawing borders. He says, as a matter of top priority, the Jews want sovereignty, statehood, and the Arabs want the Jews to have none of it. By definition, irreconcilable. And what I realized is that this has only ever been the conflict. You know, I've been giving this talk for many years. I've been writing about it for many years. And sometimes people tell me, oh, you've moved, from the left to the right. You've changed your opinions. And I tell people, I'm sorry, but it's not an opinion. This is actually, I have opinions about things. This happens not to be an opinion. This is empirical, meaning what? We had a hypothesis. Let's think like scientists. There was a hypothesis. The hypothesis said that what stands between us and peace is a Palestinian state. Now comes the important part that a lot of people like to erase. This hypothesis was tested repeatedly. Two Israeli prime ministers, Barak and Olmert, Sharon in the middle with disengagement. This hypothesis was tested multiple times, and it failed spectacularly. So like any good scientist, if the hypothesis doesn't fit the data, you're asking, okay, what else could explain the data? And the hypothesis of Bevin, the Jews want a state, the Arabs want the Jews not to have a state, unfortunately, has the best explanatory and I would say predictive power. It has literally from February 47 to the present predicted how both sides behaved at key junctures, which meaning whenever the Jews were faced with a choice, not, blah, blah, like an actual choice, you can have a state, small, it won't have Zion, it won't have Judea, but you'll have a state. The Jews said yes. The Jews, I like to say, said yes to any two-state solution as long as one of the two states is the Jewish state. Because our one non-negotiable, the one thing of why we fight, is a sovereign Jewish state. And the Arabs have rejected every two-state solution if one of the two states is the Jewish state. That's unfortunately their one non-negotiable. So once you understand that this is the conflict, and I have to share with you, it's really funny. Over the years, I would often post about it. And I would say, look, this is the conflict. The Jews want a state. The Arabs want the Jews not to have a state. That's it. And it looks like this. You would sometimes have people on my feed, Israelis or Jews will say, Einat, what are you talking about? It's about Bibi, it's about Ben-Gvir, it's about the settlements, it's about settler violence, it's about occupation, all things that I detest. So you'd have Jews and Israelis make that argument. You would not have a single Arab who would make that argument on my feed. They would all say things like, of course, Zionism is colonialism, Zionism is racism, go away to where, you came from. So they were not, in doing so, they were not disproving my thesis, they were merely justifying it. They were saying, yes, we are against the existence of a Jewish state, we just think it's justified. But none of them would say, what are you talking about? If you just have a different government, if you just get out of the West Bank, then we're good. None of them, literally none of them would say that. So that's what I'm saying. It's not an opinion. It's a hypothesis. It's empirical. Like it's a hypothesis that tested and meets the data. And that's what I've said to people over the years who would tell me, oh, Einat, you're exaggerating. You are, this is a broad brushstrokes. You're generalizing. You have your extremists. They have their extremists. I'd be like, sure, we have our extremists, but our extremists never prevented us from always remaining true to our one non-negotiable, a Jewish state. And as a result, we could compromise whether the state is smaller or bigger, but the extremists never prevented us from trying to achieve peace if the other side wanted it, or even less than that. And they don't have extremists. This is who they are. I always say, you think I'm exaggerating? You think this is a broad brushstroke? By all means, it's so easy to actually prove me wrong. Go and bring me Palestinians who publicly and in their own voice clearly say, we want to live next to a Jewish state. We just want an Arab state next to the Jewish state, not from the river to the sea. We understand that the implications are that there's no return into Israel and that there will be and that we are not perpetual refugees. And I tell them, go. And, nobody comes back, or if they do come back, they come back with the same three that I have. I just need for a second to put some electricity. Sorry. So, okay. So maybe the sound might be a bit worse, but okay. So basically, this is kind of my own personal ideas journey. And the other part that I've come to realize it, and that has to do with Zionism, and that this is why I kind of ultimately coined this phrase of like, we should all be Zionists, is that once you understand that this is what the conflict is about, you also clearly understand that the only path to peace, I would argue the only humane path, there's another path, not to peace, but to ending the conflict where the Jewish state is gone and erased. But I would say that the humane path to peace is the one where the Arab world finally, and especially the Palestinians, finally let go of what Bevin called resist to the last establishment of a Jewish state in any part of the land. A few months before October 7th, I was in a panel, and it was a panel, again, on a path to peace. And I said there, look, the peace will come when the Palestinians finally accept and embrace the equal, again, not superior, not exclusive, the equal right of the Jewish people to self-determination in their homeland, and develop a constructive vision of wanting to live next to the Jewish state rather than instead of it. So someone who was sitting on the panel to the left of me, physically and ideologically, said, what, do you want the Palestinians to be Zionists? And I said, yes. And the audience chuckled. And I said, let me make my case. For me to be on this panel about a path to peace and to be considered a mildly decent and acceptable individual, I have to recognize the Palestinian Arab right to self-determination. That's considered like a minimum acceptable position. Why is it such a major ask all of a sudden that the Jewish right to self-determination be equally accepted, aka Zionism? Why does that suddenly become like poof, like a huge ask? So yes, the path to peace does depend on Palestinians and the Arab world at large becoming Zionists. And it just means that they finally changed the lens of looking at the Jewish state from white settler European colonialist crusader, which means therefore throw them out, to ones that says, Abraham, right? We realize that you, the Jewish people, have a historical connection to that land. That historical connection is the grounds for your rights to self-determination. And we embrace you. And as Arabs and Muslims, we can recognize that. Now, as part of that, I've also come to follow the rise of anti-Zionism as a respectable ideology globally, and I've come to observe how it works with what I've come to call Palestinianism to create a very toxic and dangerous brew. Because I've watched it develop over the years in something that I've come to call the placard strategy, which is ingenious because you see it on placards in anti-Israel demonstrations. The placards are built like simple equations. They say the following: Israel, Zionism, sometimes they just draw a Star of David, then an equation sign. And I assure you, you will never see a placard that says Zionism equals the political movement for liberation and self-determination of the Jewish people in their ancestral homeland. It's a long placard, but the only accurate one. And the placard strategy has been so effective that everyone knows what's on the other side of the equation sign, right? Israel, Zionism, Star of David equals imperialism, colonialism, racism, apartheid. If you're an American in 2020, it will say white supremacy. Then it escalates: Nazism, genocide, Holocaust. Now, all these words are chosen not because they reflect reality. Actually, they are all inversions of reality. Jews have literally been the victims of each one of those: imperialism, colonialism, racism, apartheid, genocide, of course, Nazism, Holocaust, white supremacy. And they're also chosen, in no small part because the Jews were victims of those, because they're synonyms for evil. So the way that the placard strategy works is by creating this nursery rhyme repetition that repeats in placards, in media, in social media, in international institutions, in academia, of Israel, Zionism, Star of David equals evil. And the way that this works with what I've come to call Palestinianism, the ideology that is singularly devoted to the non-existence of the Jewish state, is that it fuels it and feeds it and uses it. Because if you create this notion that Israel, Zionism, and the Star of David are pure evil, you're not exactly creating an environment conducive to negotiations. Because evil you eradicate. With evil you don't negotiate. And I'll end with this. On October 7th, a new placard appeared. I followed this for 20 years, so I know when there's a new placard. And the new placard said, "Keep the world clean." And it had an image of a Star of David in the trash bin. And I remember that when I saw that, I said, bingo. This is the logical endpoint of the placard strategy, because it posits that there is a utopia out there, a clean world, salvation. And the only thing that stands between us and utopia is the collective Jew, the Star of David, which needs to be placed in the trash bin by any means necessary. We've heard that a lot after October 7th as well. And sometimes people call anti-Zionism the new anti-Semitism, as if there's anything new. But anti-Semitism has always been about the idea that there is a utopia, and between this messy, dirty world and utopia and salvation stands the collective Jew. And it's not a coincidence that all the evil words are on the side of Israel, Zionism, Star of David, and all the good words, justice, equality, freedom, and rights, are on the side of Palestinianism. And this is why you saw suddenly Palestine is about human rights, Palestine is about climate change, Palestine is about queer rights, trans rights, Palestine is about fighting capitalism. If you think about it objectively, it sounds moronic, unless you understand that what underpins it is the idea that Palestinianism as the erasure of Zionism, of the collective Jew, will bring us to utopia. And then all these things are utopia. So this is why I think we should all be Zionists, because it's the path to peace. It's the path against this dangerous utopianism. And it is, I think, the way to stand against a lot of these very dangerous ideas. And let me stop here.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Einat. You've given us a lot to think about. Let me just remind everyone who's with us, and we have a large group. If you want to pose a question, we already have quite a long list of questions. Please use the Q&A tab, not the chat, because that's where we're going to draw the questions from. So before I pick up on the various questions that have been submitted, Einat, I want to just touch upon a couple of themes that you have raised and solicit your response. You and I are of the same generation. We both lived, I think, in Jerusalem in the middle to late 1990s. And I, like yourself, at that time, a young lawyer at the Department of Justice, I worked on legal cooperation, trying to think about how do we make sure that the day after an agreement is signed with the Palestinians, everybody feels the benefits, it's win-win. And I, lived in especially around 1999 with Barak, with the sense that we may be within reach of an agreement. And then came the Second Intifada. And I think the Second Intifada was a real turning point for our generation. And I think October 7th is another major turning point for the generation after us. And that will have a legacy and that will have a lingering effect for a long time. I am curious by your own experience and reaction to October 7th and where it leaves us. And a lot of the questions that we have right now on being asked is, is the two-state solution vision dead? If so, what are the implications? Could there be a new paradigm for resolving the conflict, perhaps with a new regional infrastructure with Saudi normalization? What's your thinking about the prospects of resolving not the Arab-Israeli conflict, on which we've made a lot of progress, but the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? So that's one theme. The second theme, you very beautifully and succinctly define Zionism as Jewish sovereignty. And some of the questions that we're getting is asking you to unpack the concept of Zionism a little bit further. And let me just share this with you and the audience very briefly, kind of how I understand Zionism, Zionut, and ask for your reflection. So there is no doubt that there's a sort of a strong element, a modern liberal element. Zionism is really a modern liberal doctrine of national self-determination and liberation from imperialism and colonialism. And there's a sense of empowerment, the right to have a home, the right to be a full human being, and not to be a guest, not to always be at the mercy of somebody else, not to be perpetually homeless and powerless. So that's, I think when you say Jewish sovereignty, this is what you are essentially referring to. But there are two additional aspects to Zionism that I think are very, very important. The second is the idea of normalcy and the idea of acceptance, not just at home, but globally. The dream that Herzl and others have had to be a nation among the nations, to be treated equally among other nations, which really has to do with this fundamental concept of legitimacy. And I think that much of what we have seen and much of what you're talking about has really been an assault on the most fundamental legitimacy of the right of the Jewish people to equal treatment in the international system. We have heard on campuses on the United States, elsewhere, including on this campus at Stanford, people chanting, "We don't want no two states, we want all of 48." So this thing has no legitimacy. It doesn't matter what the borders are. It doesn't matter what concessions you make. This thing has to be completely eradicated. The Jews are fundamentally illegitimate. Their existence is a crime. Their collective existence is a crime. And that, I think, goes to the essence of what you are talking about. I think that there's a third element of Zionism, which for me is profoundly inspiring, but I think for other people is actually quite threatening. And I think that a lot of anti-Zionism is really driven out of jealousy. Because Israel is such a phenomenal success, it is such a daily reminder to the authoritarian regimes all across the Middle East and the world of what you can do with very little when you have powerful ideas of empowerment and entrepreneurship. There is a spirit of Zionism. There is this kind of a notion that I think is captured beautifully in Hatikva, that we, with will, with hard work, with love and determination, can over time bend reality to a vision of self-realization. And that, to me, Haruach HaTzionit, the Zionist spirit, has this kind of notion of, the difficult we do immediately and the impossible takes a little longer, but we're going to get there. And I think that's very inspiring to some people, but also very annoying and threatening to others. And one of the features that you see with sort of anti-Zionist, what you call the sort of Palestinianist kind of ethos, is a profound sense of victimhood, perhaps, a profound sense of nihilism. It's not a coincidence that we see people like Greta Thunberg, donning the keffiyeh and linking climate crisis to Zionism. There is a kind of, I think, nervousness and rejection of that can-do Zionist spirit, which I think is so powerful and so palpable in Israel, and is a source of such strength to Israeli society. So anyway, those are some of my comments. I now see that we have 24 questions that have been posted. So, but why don't we start with those, Einat? Let you respond to those, and then I'll pick up on some additional questions. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So I'll start from the last one. Absolutely. I don't think it's a coincidence that the more successful Arab countries are the ones that are normalizing relations with Israel. Anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism has a very strong element of scapegoating. It's the mark of failed societies, societies in crisis, societies that prefer to blame rather than to do and to solve problems. And it's not a coincidence that a lot of those societies ultimately collapse, unfortunately, not before creating a lot of damage often to their Jewish population, but it is typically the mark of failed societies. So yes, I completely agree with you. Many years ago, I wrote a piece about the true intersectionality of Zionism, that the danger some see is what will happen if everyone's a Zionist, if everyone has this can-do spirit. And like you said, if people realize that you can build a lot, not just from nothing, less than nothing. One of my favorite visuals, I like to show how the areas allocated to the Jewish state in the UN partition plan were the lands that the Jews reclaimed from malaria. So you literally start with less than nothing. You start with malaria-ridden swampland and you turn it into a state. So the idea that you can really create something out of less than nothing is, I agree with you, a very dangerous idea. So yeah, but also one that I think is indeed ultimately inspiring. What you said about the normalcy and the Zionist is absolutely true as well. This is also part of why, when I say we should all be Zionists, it's part of like, it basically means that more and more parts of the world finally come to look at Jewish liberty, self-determination, self-mastery as something normal rather than as a religious affront to the natural order of things, even when it's secularized. And the Arabs have a phrase, a very old one, which is called Zionist aggression. And again, often when Westerners hear Zionist aggression, they think it means that the Arabs are angry at something that Israel did. What they don't understand is that the Arabs use this term to reflect what Israel is. Zionist aggression is Zionism, meaning the aggression is in the very daring of the Jews to expect to be treated as equals, as sovereign, as people worthy of a state. And you're right, a lot of what we're going through is that this idea of normalcy is very far from the fact that still, I have a colleague that said that Zionism is entirely normal, of movement for self-determination of a people in their homeland. He says it's anti-Zionism, which is insane. And the inability of the Jews still to achieve complete normalcy, even though we have bouts of that, is because so much of parts of the world still views the idea of Jewish sovereignty, Jewish power, Jewish self-determination as an affront to the natural order. And this actually also goes to the day after and two states and all that. I love when people say, the two-state paradigm is gone. And sometimes you hear it from Arabs, and they typically say it in a way as if they really, really tried, and God damn it, because of Netanyahu or Ben-Gvir and Smotrich or some settlements that were built, ain't going to happen. But of course, the reality is that there was never, not for a single moment in the last century, a Palestinian Arab vision of peace where there was a Jewish state anywhere to be found. And the reason that I place so much emphasis on perpetual refugeehood and this idea of return is that over the years, I've come to realize that those are the most reliable litmus tests of whether someone is serious about living next to a Jewish state. You know, during the 90s, that's when you were working on it. Palestinians said 2 states. And we assumed that one of the two is the Jewish state. In retrospect, we had to check because they meant no such thing. They meant an Arab state in the West Bank and Gaza and another Arab state to replace Israel through this mechanism of refugee return. They're not refugees, there's no right of return, but that's what they imagined, which is why when they had to sign an agreement that said it ain't going to happen, they walked away and followed it up with a campaign of butchery. So the problem has never been the precise political mechanism. You will know that. So many teams have spent so many years planning the details of how the 2 states will live. But the foundation was that the Palestinians never wanted a state. As Bevan correctly noted, they first wanted the Jews not to have a state. After that, it doesn't really matter anymore. So I say, I'm not dealing with the politics, with the vision. First, Palestinianism as an ideology, not the people, but the ideology has to die. When the people who currently hold this ideology finally transform to become a people who have a constructive ideology, then the exact political arrangement of how we live side by side becomes the easy and I would say less important part of the equation.
On that point, Einat, we're getting quite a few questions of so how do we get there? And I think both you and I will agree that this is not something that anybody can impose on Palestinian society from outside. Well, okay, so let's talk about that. My sense is that the capacity of external actors to transform fundamental norms and deep-rooted notions of political culture, not impossible. We've seen this happening sometimes in even sort of a modern history. The idea that an idea cannot die is simply wrong. Ideas die all the time, so that can change. But I'm very skeptical of these kind of notions that somehow, we'll bring in the Emiratis, we'll bring in the Bahrainis, we'll bring in the Saudis, and they will somehow magically transform 100 years of Arab and later on Palestinian recalcitrance and sort of refusal to accept the existence of the Jews as neighbors. How do you see that? So how do we get out of this trap, this fundamental trap that you've outlined?
So I actually do think that the external forces are incredibly important. Because at the end of the day, the number of people, the Palestine Arabs, there are a few millions. It's not a lot of people. Their ability for over a century to persist in this total annihilationist ideology through repeated failures that have brought them nothing but misery and destruction, their ability to persist in that always came from the fact that they were supported. So actually, I believe that the only way that this can even begin to change is if you begin to remove the fuel that sustains it. And that actually has a lot of precedence. You can show societies again and again in various aspects when they are not supported, when there's no fuel, when reality basically ultimately sends them the message in a variety of ways of enough is enough, what you begin to see is change takes place. You begin to have voices that say, yeah, how about we really stop with it? And, but if you're constantly fueling this, then you're creating no space for change. So for me, the way to do it is first, we need to understand that this is what needs to be done and that there are no shortcuts. I'm working now on a short book that will have the lovely title of Peace Not Now. And the idea is that that we've tried shortcuts. We were so desperate. We so badly wanted peace that we tried a lot of shortcuts, direct negotiations, give them land, unilateral disengagement, whatever, just bribe them, Qatari money, just like, these are a lot of shortcuts. And all these shortcuts were actually a way of avoiding dealing with what I call the molten lava of Palestinianism. So my argument is that we actually need to, first of all, make it clear that this is it and there's nothing else. There's no way around it. There's nothing else. There's no shortcuts. We actually have to deal with the thing itself. We have to make it clear that this is the goal, transforming the Palestinians from a people who seek the destruction of the Jewish state to a people who seek to build something for themselves. Once you define that as the goal, you begin to methodically, step one, remove anything that fuels the counter of that goal. This is why I've devoted so much of my life to UNRWA. It always looked like some fringe obsession to people. But UNRWA sits at the original sin of the global fueling of Palestinianism. That is what extended the war and the suffering for all. So we need to be very methodical and clear-sighted in beginning to remove anything. The same, the Saudis, the Emiratis, first of all, I think if they don't understand it, I mean, I'm sure they do, but we definitely should say that they have an interest in seeing Palestinianism defeated. Palestinianism, like I said, is, because at the end of the day, it's just a mark of anti-Zionism, brings societies down. We see now Turkey and Qatar becoming the new sponsors of Palestinianism as Iran begins to exit the stage. And I always like to look at the century-long supporters of Palestinianism, from the Nazis to the Pan-Arabists, the Nasserites to the Soviets to the Ayatollahs. And I say, look, ultimately, they all end up in the dustbin of history, and it's no coincidence, because if you go with a destructive ideology, it destroys your society. Why Turkey and Qatar think that they want to be sponsors of Palestinianism? Someone recently said that Palestinianism and anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are essentially like the ring in Lord of the Rings. Like, it's really, really attractive. It's very tempting, but ultimately it destroys its wearer. So Saudi, the Emiratis, they should know by now that Palestinianism, certainly when it's fueled by the Muslim Brotherhood, leads to nothing good. So they should have every interest in bringing about its demise. And I'll just end with this thing. This is why I'm really, really worried right now, because one of the things that creates the opportunity for intellectual and ideological change is a moment of destruction. It's true personally, it's true collectively. When you reach a moment of devastation, a window opens, as I said, both in the personal and collective life, to say, maybe what I've been doing until the present has not been working out so well. So this window opens. And what I fear is we're about to squander the opportunity again. Rather than say to Palestinians, look, the destruction in Gaza is not a tsunami. It's not a natural disaster. It is the direct outcome and consequence of your choice to prioritize destroying the Jewish state and turning Gaza into an integrated weaponized landscape, rather than to make it the export trading culture and tourism hub that it could be. It's your choice, and these are the consequences of your choice. So sit with that choice. There will be no reconstruction. There will be no billions flowing until you show us that you have a different mindset. And I fear that we're about to squander this moment of connecting the choice with its consequences.
So Einat, I'm bunching up a number of questions. We have a lot of them, but the themes are shared by several questions. So I want to. There are a number of questions that are pushing back against your thesis. I think on two main bases, and I want to put them before you because I think these are arguments that we have to take seriously. One is this idea of the original sin argument, right? The argument is that everything you're saying ignores and the reason why Israel is illegitimate. It's because it displaced a prior indigenous population and essentially created a kind of a Western outpost on pre-existing Palestinian land. Okay, so how do we sort of address that indigeneity and settler colonialism claim? Related to that, but a different argument has to do with this question of Israel's desire, I would say fundamental need to be both a Jewish and democratic state. And then the question becomes, how could you be a democracy over time when you continue a state of occupation over another people, right? This argument is, you can't have your cake and eat it at the same time. You can't continue to occupy millions of people and continue to sort of not extend political rights to those people and then say that you are a democracy. So let's deal with those two arguments in the context of your view. The last the last theme that is coming up a lot here, and I apologize, we do have an unusually large group and we won't be able to cover everything. As I said, we'll make every effort to make sure that we can have Einat here with us for a week at least, and then you'll have plenty of opportunities to engage her on some of these issues. But there are a lot of questions about the current ceasefire deal, your understanding of the ceasefire deal, your prognosis for whether it's going to hold. I'm referring, of course, to the ceasefire for hostages a deal. So perhaps we'll end on that.
Okay. So on the issue of displacement, there is a reason that I bring the Bevin quote from February 47, because in February 47, no one has been displaced. And already in February 47, when there's supposedly no reason, this is why I said all the excuses are gone. No settlements, no displacement, no refugees, nothing. He recognizes that the problem is not that people were displaced. The problem is that there is a Jewish state. And I don't know if this will come through. I generally don't use visuals, but tell me if you can see this. That this is like the orange and green map is the partition. And the two-toned blue map is the incidence of malaria in the early 20th century. If you want, you can, it's on my Twitter feed and you can see it later. And I can send it if people want. So on the eve of partition, where the Jews are being proposed to have a state on the lands they reclaimed from malaria, where basically almost no one was displaced, and desert, no one was displaced, the Arabs of the land say absolutely not. Even on those lands where no one was displaced, what we care is that the Jews not have a state. The Arabs are only displaced as a result of their ideology of no Jewish state. We could have celebrated an Arab state and a Jewish state living in peace side by side, 76 years of independence. But no, the Arabs, as Bevin talking to them, and as they said clearly, were more concerned with the Jews not achieving sovereignty than having their own state. They failed to achieve it. In the course of war, people were displaced, which is actually not unique and very normal. What is not normal is that then they decided to perpetuate it in order to try to still undo the Jewish state. So one of the markers by which the conflict is mistold is the reversal of cause and effect, and this is the first among them. Later ones will be like, oh, Palestinians are angry because there's a wall, right? Or a fence between Israel and the West Bank. Why is there a fence, right? It didn't just come out of nowhere. It's like again and again, cause and effect are reversed. And this is the original one. The cause is the Arab ideology clearly declared of to resist to the last Jewish sovereignty in any part of the land. The failure to achieve that creates displacement. But again, being displaced is not unique. Tens of millions of people were displaced at the same time, and they're not organized around trying to destroy their next door neighbors. They moved on with their lives. UNRWA, this is again why I focus on it, basically intervened at this point or hijacked by the Arab refugees to say, no, you do not move on with your lives because your goal remains unchanged, no Jewish state. So again, this is the classic reversal of cause and effect, and it is the hallmark of how the conflict is mistold. And that also goes back to the notion that there are never consequences. My colleague, Dr. Shani Moore, wrote a great piece after October 7th called Ecstasy and Amnesia, talking about how Palestinians often go to war with ecstasy. We saw it on October 7th. We saw it in 1947. They're going to destroy Jewish sovereignty. And then when they fail, amnesia sets in. We're seeing it as well, as if they made no choice. They took no action that has any consequences. The Jewish democratic one is one of my favorite. It's quite easy. It's one of the reasons that I failed to get very excited during the heydays of the battle over judicial reform, because I think, and I've studied that and I've written about it, what sustains Israeli democracy is in large part, in my view, not this or that institutional arrangement, but the Jewish culture of argument. Israel is one of the very few countries to be established after World War II to emerge as a democracy, to remain a democracy uninterrupted by civil wars, military coups, suspension of elections. It's actually a remarkable achievement. When you put into that waves of immigration unprecedented in scale, wars, terrorism, the achievement of Israeli democracy emerges as unparalleled, and I would credit the Jewish tradition of argumentation to the majority of that. So for me, I think they said it's Aaron Barak, but whoever coined the idea of Jewish and democratic as two opposites made a terrible, terrible error. Israel is democratic because it's Jewish. If it's not Jewish, it's not going to be democratic. For me, very easy, very simple. Those are not things that are against each other. I can tell you that as a member of Knesset, literally every debate in the plenary, regardless of what was written underneath on TV, was basically a form of Jewish argumentation, whether on taxes or immigration.
But what do you do with a prolonged period of time?
Okay, so let me get to the occupation.
Where people are not extended full political rights, right? That's the argument.
Okay, so now again, the question is, why is there an occupation and why is it extended? Because again, reversal of cause and effect. Israel controls these territories, right? Because the Arab countries in 49 made it very clear that they refuse to make peace with Israel and they will only have a ceasefire. I can talk a lot about how the entire tragedy of the conflict is a tragedy of ceasefires, and this will bring me to the last point. Because every time the message is, you get a redo, you get a redo. You don't have to accept that you were defeated. So they redid in 67 and failed again. So Israel occupies these territories, some it annexes, some it doesn't. It repeatedly tries to negotiate ending the occupation, right? occupations are not illegal. Occupations, as I'm sure you know, are the legal means by which you control territory until you can negotiate how it's governed. Israel repeatedly tried, but every time that the so-called occupied, the Palestinians said, we're offered, end the occupation, but that means you live next to a Jewish state, they said, absolutely not. We will continue to fight another day. So the reason that Israel is still stuck, and this is why October 7th makes the stuckness even more difficult, is that how are we going to get out of this mess? Direct negotiations don't lead to anything because the Palestinians will not sign anything that acknowledges the existence of a Jewish state, which means no return. So they will not sign to that. Unilateral disengagement, we did it in Gaza, we know how it ended. How do we get out of here? So I will argue that despite the effort to conflate them, Israel, within its sovereign territory, is very much a democracy, a strong democracy. And yes, it is stuck militarily controlling a people who continue to be devoted to its non-existence. It is a challenge, but I don't think it's a challenge that undermines Israeli democracy. Israel has repeatedly been willing to get to an agreement, but the agreement cannot be Israeli suicide. It can't be that the answer is either you commit suicide or you are guilty of some terrible sin. No, we will continue the occupation as long as the Palestinian war against Jewish sovereignty continues. Occupations are the legal means by which you control territory until the war ends, which is why the Palestinian war against Jewish sovereignty needs to end. That's what's at the core of everything. Okay, and finally to a ceasefire. I'll just say this. At this point, I don't think we had much choice. I don't know if it will hold or not. But in terms of the deal itself, we got the worst of both worlds. The world of the Biden administration that allowed to normalize a kidnapping extortion situation to be called a negotiated deal. I was appalled from day one. I kept saying that, and I was appalled as it was normalized. Take the deal, don't take the deal, negotiate the deal. I'm like, really? So that's where we're at? You invade a country, you kidnap, you butcher, you mutilate, and then it's a negotiating situation? So we got that, and the deal that was negotiated, under the aegis of Qatar, which was not a benevolent mediator, but merely protecting its Hamas assets, was this extended collective torture deal that is designed to keep Hamas in power, to ensure that Palestinians do not have to come to terms with the consequences of their ideology and their choice, that the billions will keep flowing in. So we had a terrible deal being negotiated under an insane notion that this is even a deal to be negotiated. And then this met with Trump's urgency. And then we got basically the worst of both worlds. At this point, I think we have no choice, but we and so many others have made so many clear errors. Barbara Tuchman said that the way you know that this is a march of folly is that in real time, you should have been able to know. In retrospect, that's not interesting. So this is in real time. In real time, we could see that it was a march of folly to normalize extortion as negotiation, to normalize kidnapping as a basis for a deal. In real time, we could see that it is folly, and yet it was done. And at this point, I don't see that we have much choice, but we should be under no illusion. All of us are thrilled to see the hostages come back, but I doubt that anyone thinks it's a good deal. Everyone knows it's a terrible one. They just say at this point, we had no choice.
Yeah, I argued in an article in Persuasion this week, which people can find online, that this deal just doesn't make any strategic sense. It makes a lot of emotional sense, right? We're all incredibly vested and moved profoundly by the return of every single hostage, and we hope for the safe return of all of them. But from a strategic point of view, this only makes sense under two possibilities. One is that nobody has any real intention of going beyond the first phase, the first ceasefire of 6 weeks. I think that's tenuous. I think that's going to be difficult for the reasons you've articulated. And second is that if there's some kind of second deal that we don't yet know about, that will reframe this situation and will take us into new diplomatic vistas. So that to me is those are the only conditions where this on its face terrible deal make any sense. Einat, we could go on and on. I'd love to hear your thoughts about the state of Israeli education. I'd love to hear more from you about UNRWA and possibilities of alternative models for reconstruction of Gaza. I'd love to hear much more from you about the state of Israeli democracy, separation of powers, the rule of law. There's so much to talk about. As I've said, we are really looking forward to an opportunity to try to have you here, visit us properly. But for now, we're going to end. So Dr. Einat Wilf, author, podcaster, and one of Israel's most fascinating thinkers, thank you for being with us today. Let me just remind everyone, over the coming weeks, we will hold conversations with Ari Shavit, with Eugene Kandel, with Yuli Tamil, and with Yoav Heller. And please join us for those. And from the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, here at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford, thank you, everyone, for your amazing engagement and wonderful questions. Again, we've tried to cover as much as we could in the time that we have. We haven't exhausted the subject, but the subject is close to exhausting us. So we'll log off now, and thank you and goodbye.